Get us moving here. It's good, no microphone, so now let's see if I can, does that go forward or backward? Yeah. Much easier, not holding the microphone. So, thank you guys again. This is the last one for me, which is good. But, and we're going to go, I don't know if Carlos said 1 hour, we're going to go 1 hour. So, complete core, what we're going to try to do here is take a lot of what you heard from Sue and a lot of what you heard from Michael and make it make sense so that we can do it with our clients. That's going to kind of be the goal for what we're looking for. Obviously, I want to thank these guys. Well, actually, it's funny. It says Chris Poirier and Perform Better because obviously I didn't change that slide. It's supposed to be Carlos and Perform Better Brazil. But also our staff, because we're here for a week, which is awesome. Yeah, Chris, you get the nice thank you there. That's poor preparation on my part, just in case you guys are interested in that. But our staff, obviously, because we get to leave for 8 days. And the cool thing is everything still runs at home, which is very, very good. And as I said, I've said it a bunch of times. I know we've all said it, but thank you. It's still amazing. Normally, I will tell you at a Sunday in a U.S. seminar, there will be probably a third of the people here that are here right now in terms of a lot of people will be like, okay, it's Sunday, I'm going home. You guys are still here, still hanging in. So we thank you for that part too. As I said, this is my contact info, which I haven't put up already, which is interesting. But that is my only email address. If, again, if you have a question, email me. I try to get back to everybody. So don't be afraid to send an email. Please be afraid to send a lot of emails. Okay, I don't want one every day. I mean, I love that I've made lots of new friends here, but try to keep it to the real stuff. That's Twitter, obviously, is there at mboyle1959. Instagram, which people are using the heck out of here, which is amazing. I'm amazed at how big Instagram is in Brazil, because I'm still trying to accept and do all that stuff. There's we got a lot of them today. There's a lot of pictures, a lot of stories. So most of you have already found that one, so we don't have to worry about that too much. I talked about Strength Coach yesterday, so I won't even worry about that. But one of the things I'm trying to do, we talked yesterday, getting better. I'm trying to get better as a presenter. To get better as a presenter, one of the things in one of the books I read is that give people 3 things that matter. So one thing I want you to think about, breathing matters. Obviously, Michael talked about breathing. Sue talked about breathing a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about breathing. I'm going to try to make breathing simple. 2, flexion and rotation are generally going to be bad ideas when it comes to core training. I think this is going to be the most difficult part for most people today when I show you some stuff and I say, I don't think you should do this. We'll get to that point. And then 3rd, learn motor control. And Sue alluded to this, Michael alluded to this. We've got to get you to be able to understand how to move your extremities, how to move your arms, and how to move your legs without moving your spine. If we look at back pain, in my mind, most of back pain is poor motor control. Most of back pain is people moving in compensatory patterns. So just try to think about these 3 things while we're going through this next hour. The other objective, I want to try to clear some of this stuff up. I want to make it simple. Some of the misconceptions, some of the disagreements about core training, because one of the things that we find with core training is some people will look and say, well, you said this, this person says this person says this. I'm going to try to pull as much of this as I can and to highlight the similarities for you instead of the differences. And like I said yesterday, actionable information for tomorrow. I want you to be able to go back and say, I have a much better idea what I want to do with my clients from a warm-up standpoint. I understand what I'm doing from a core training standpoint, and I can implement that right away when I get there. And I said this already, but most of you have Sue's got a line of people out the door out there with the book, but in terms of her 8th chapter in this book is worth the price of the book. And I've said that a bunch of times to a bunch of people, but the chapter on breathing, and you'll realize, I always say, great minds think alike, so that's why I like it. But we're sending, Sue and I, it was really funny. I watched her present last year in Long Beach, California, and I was amazed at how similar what we were doing was, and we hadn't talked about this at all. We had not had any conversation about core training in a really long time, and we both ended up in a very, very similar place. And she does a really, really good job in the book of covering the kind of interrelationship, and that's what we're going to talk about, of breathing to core training. And this, Thomas Myers said this one day at a seminar, and I loved the quote. Because he got up and he said, 50% of what I'm going to tell you today is wrong. And I don't know which 50% that is. And that's true. One of the things, we're always getting smarter. I'm going to talk to you today about stuff that I've changed, things that I do differently, things that I didn't believe 2 years ago, that I strongly believe now. And that relates really strongly to what we talked about last night in terms of that ability to change. What we want to be adaptive. We want to be able to learn and think, okay, this makes sense. This is better than what I did before. I need to do this. And we need, as we said, actionable info. I need to go put that stuff into my program right away. I'm going to take out the bad stuff. I'm going to take out the things I don't like anymore, and I'm going to put in the good stuff. That's how we do it. That's how we do it all of the time. I also love this quote. If you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. So when you listen to someone and you think, I don't really understand what they're saying, that makes me think they don't really know what they're talking about. Okay? I'm going to try to make this simple for you. I want you to sit there and be like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. And hopefully that's the goal. I don't know. We'll see at the end if I hit it. Maybe I hit it. Maybe I don't. Because this is another really important quote. What I believe, any fool can make something complicated. It takes a genius to make it simple. So when you're talking about saying to people, okay, we're going to try to talk about core training for your average client in a personal training setting or for your average athlete in a team setting, we want to make it simple. I don't want it to be complicated. It can't, if you're going to be successful in business, it can't be complicated. Because you got to be able to reproduce this over and over again. If you ever come and watch us, we train about 600 people a day in the summer. And if we don't have a system and if it's not simple, we can't train 600 people in a day. And we can't train 600 people from 11 years old up to people in their 80s unless it's simple, unless it all makes sense. So, I mean, it's funny. And this looks like a really old picture. I will tell you that that was core training when I was in high school. When I tell you that we legitimately, held plates behind our back, put plates on our chest, hooked our feet underneath stuff, this is what we did. But before we even do that, let's talk a little bit, okay, because we use it, we're always talking core training, right? Well, what's the core? I think if we don't define a little bit of what is the core, where is the core, then we can't really have the conversation, right? Because if we look at this, most people say, well, is this the core? Internal oblique, external oblique, transverse abdominis, rectus abdominis. I would say it's part of the core, right? But I would look at this, exact part of the core. If you listen to Michael talk yesterday, one of the things I've realized from Michael is your ribs are a really big part of the core. Your thoracic spine is a really big part of the core. It's not as simple as the muscles that are in the front, right? Your quadratus lumborum, your multifidi, these are all parts of the core and parts of core training. Hips, is that part of the core? As far as I'm concerned, absolutely. Because that ability to move your hip, that ability to stabilize your hip, all that stuff's going to become critical in core training. So when we start thinking about glute medius, glute max, glute min, that's going to be part of your core. This is the stuff Michael talked about yesterday, and this is the new stuff. I think one of the best things that ever happened to us was, one, I got curious about PRI. Two, being curious about PRI, Postural Restoration Institute, so we don't throw around too many abbreviations. Postural Restoration Institute led me to find Michael Mullen, because I said I need to find somebody to talk to us about this idea. And then Michael has since become an incredibly good speaker, not about Postural Restoration Institute, but about posture and respiration, which is significantly more important. The big thing to understand here, and Sue's still outside signing, but we brought Sue in maybe 10 years ago. She was visiting Boston. I said, will you come and do an in-service for our staff? And she was like, of course I will. And so she shows up, and she gets up in her typical kind of bubbly Sue thing, and she's like, we're going to talk all about the diaphragm, my favorite muscle. And I was kind of sitting in the back like, is the diaphragm a muscle? Because that was where I was 10 years ago. I was literally like, diaphragm, I'm like, I thought it was kind of like a thing, but And then she starts talking about the diaphragm contracting, and what happens on inhalation, what happens on exhalation. And I'm like, I got some learning to do, right? But you start to realize, and then you look at the PRI people and say, not only is it a muscle, but it's an asymmetrical muscle. Not only is it a muscle, but it's an asymmetrical muscle. It's affected by where your heart is. And suddenly, we went, but prior to Michael Mullen, we were very worried about symmetry. Because everybody in training was worried about symmetry. If you did the FMS, we were worried about symmetry. We don't want asymmetries. And then you'd realize, we're never going to fix asymmetries. We're asymmetrical. We're left-hearted whether we want to be or not. That doesn't make any difference. And that part, the fact that there's one heart, one liver, it makes us asymmetrical. And it makes us, like Michael said, it makes us a little twisted. And it makes us, he showed you all those pictures. Again, look at me. Right shoulder drop, right? I mean, everybody's got it if you're right-handed. But what you don't realize is that there's flexions and rotations. It's not like my shoulder blade just slipped down. It just looks like that's what happened. So just understand that this is part of the core, that diaphragm. We're going to talk a huge amount about breathing, because to me, understanding the diaphragm is the biggest thing that changed what we're doing right now from a core training perspective. Right? But then again, we talk hips, adductors, hip flexors, right? Again, core. Is your iliacus and your psoas part of your core? Absolutely. Are they hugely important parts of your core? Absolutely. Are they huge players in back pain? Absolutely. Is it the most mysterious muscle group in the body? Absolutely. Because you still don't have people who can agree and tell you, this is what psoas does. You still can't have people who tell you, this is what iliacus does. People are still arguing, stabilizer or mover. But we'll talk about that too. But what you've got to understand, so we've got this core, which is now, diaphragm and ribs and anterior abdominal muscles and low back muscles and hip muscles and adductor muscles. And that's all going to be part of this core thing that we're going to talk about. So here in my mind, and this is the thing, right? If someone said to me, define the core, I am going to define the core as a deliberately constrained transfer system. And you might sit here and go, I don't know what you mean, deliberately constrained transfer system. What I mean is that it is a system that is designed to help us transfer motion from the ground into our upper body. That's its job, right? When I say deliberately constrained, okay, is there anybody here, if I said, I need you to turn around and look at the back of the room, I need you to turn your head 180 degrees. Anybody here can turn their head 180 degrees? Right? Nobody. It's deliberately constrained. You're not supposed to be able to turn and look behind you. Right? Like Sue said, the spine's supposed to move, but there's a certain amount of motion that it is given on purpose. Okay, imagine if someone came in and I said, I'm going to work on you today, and I'm going to manipulate your head until you can see behind you. Right? I'd kill you. You'd die. But when we think about thoracic spine or lumbar spine, we sometimes keep thinking, we want to make that more motion. We don't want to make it more motion. It's deliberately constrained. You got big bones on the bottom of your spine for a reason. You've got more thoracic vertebrae than lumbar vertebrae for a reason. Like Sue said, it would all be one big bone. That's true. But if they were all doing the same thing, they'd all look exactly alike. They'd all have the same facets. They'd all have the same size. They'd all have the same structure. They don't. It is a deliberately constrained system. Keep that thought in your head. So if we talk about core stability, to me, core stability is the ability to move my extremities without moving in the middle. That's going to be my definition of core stability. I'm not going to compensate if I'm trying to lift my hands up over my head, and Michael talked about this yesterday, Sue talked about it. If I have to lean back to lift my arms up, my back's going to hurt. If in the same way, if I can't get into hip extension without going into lumbar extension, my back is going to hurt. So I need to be able to have, and we're not saying that it's not supposed to move. What we're saying is that the extremities are supposed to move more. We don't want compensatory motion through our core. So that's really, really important for us to understand. What a lot of people would talk about this, that's why we said, we would call it in our CFSC motor control. We're going to do motor control drills. We're going to teach you, and Sue was, showing that, she said, we love the floor slide too. For the same reason, it's a motor control drill. Can I move my shoulders without compensatory movement of my spine? And whether we're looking at things like leg lowers or bridging or whatever it is, can I move my hips without compensatory movement of my spine? That's what we want to have. That's what we're trying to develop. The good thing is, and we're going to go over this when we do the practical stuff, it's pretty easy to figure out, to see, and to think, okay, that's not good. We got to fix that. As long as we know what we're looking for and as long as we know what we want to fix. So what are we going to do? And you've heard these names a bunch today, but we're going to talk about people like Paul Hodges, Stuart McGill, Shirley Sarman, James Porterfield and Carl DeRosa, Ron Ruska, Philip Beach, who Sue put Philip's Muscles and Meridian's book up already, and try to get some of their ideas into a really simple, user-friendly form. We're going to be able to look at this and think, oh, okay, I can kind of roll all this stuff in together, and basically for us, you make it a warm-up. The thing to understand, I am not, and because this is the third time I've talked, you get it. I'm not the expert. I'm the interpreter. I'm the person who pulls all the information together from the experts. The experts are up there. The experts are in the books that we read. What I'm good at is reading their stuff and thinking, how does it apply to all of us? How do we use this stuff? How do we take that information and put it into a program for a person so that they can then benefit from that program? That's what we're going to do. And another thing I would tell you is be careful with people who tell you the experts are wrong. And this is kind of my rant from yesterday. 10 years from now, I'm going to tell you who all these people are. But I love reading on the internet when someone says, oh, I don't agree with McGill. Right? Hello. She gets my jokes, this lady. I'm afraid to say that might be because you're a little older than the average kid in this audience. But when someone says to me, I think McGill is wrong. And I look at them and I'm like, how can you think McGill is wrong? Have you spent your entire life studying the spine? Or did you read one book and decide, I still like crunches, I think McGill's wrong? And so just be careful with these. There are a lot of contrarians in our field, people who realize I can generate attention for myself by disagreeing. And when I disagree, because there's a lot of other people who maybe kind of disagree too and think, oh, this guy, I'll believe him, I'll follow him because he's telling me what I want to hear. I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear, but I am going to tell you what I think you should hear, and they're not the same things. The other thing, Mike and Sue talked a lot about rehab. Most of us are not doing rehab. Most of us are doing, the vast majority of the people in here are doing personal training. So don't get stuck, don't rehab people who aren't hurt. And we did that. I've done this. We've all, I think, in the process of trying to learn core training and learn how to do this, I think I spent some time doing things that people didn't even need to do. There was nothing wrong with them. I was fixing something that wasn't broken. So just be careful and realize that, okay, I can keep it pretty simple. I can keep it pretty basic. I don't have to protect this person from, the invisible boogeyman. I don't know if boogeyman transfers in Brazilian, then maybe there's some thing that works for that. But and our 2-day programs don't contain a lot of direct core work. If you've got 2-day personal training clients, you might be doing 2 or 3 core exercises a day. The good thing for us is a lot of our core will get incorporated into our warm-up. And as I said, when we get to the practical, you'll see how we put that stuff into the warm-up. So let's brief, quick history, right? This is the old school core, 1970. Michael Boyle doing sit-ups in his basement, right? Old school labs. Like if you're still doing stuff like this, okay, you're the person I was talking about last night. You're 20 years behind. Today is going to be a good opportunity for you to catch up, right? I think this period, I call this the silly core period. We got very fascinated for a while with stability balls and silly stability ball exercises. And it was almost like the sillier it was, the better it was for you. We've since gotten away from that. We're still using stability balls, but not nearly like we did probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? From there, we had, again, if you've been around for a long time, we had the drawing period. Everything was about drawing in your, transverse abdominis. People, you got to contract your transverse. You got to contract your transverse. That was kind of closer. That was like the Paul Hodges, very Australian influence. Paul Chek, if you studied Paul Chek stuff, there was a lot of talk about drawing in. And we did a lot. I mean, we did all kinds of drawing in. All different ways to suck our stomachs in, and we were close. We weren't quite there. I'm going to show you that still kind of is a good idea, except we're going to show you how it changes, right? Then this guy comes along, what I would call, the Canadian period, and all of a sudden Stu shows up, and Stu takes the world by storm in terms of core training, because he's a big, confident guy who gets up there and says, you're all wrong. Okay? You're all wrong and you're hurting people. I love that. I absolutely love that. When he got up there and, he just started talking about, and he was backing it up with science. He spent his whole life studying spines. And I love people said, oh, you only studied pig spines. I'm like, well, human spines are harder to come by. Right? There's not a lot of people, if you said to somebody, someone said, oh, he put a pig spine, in the thing and he blew up the discs, but it was a pig spine. I'm like, but imagine if I came in and said, I need some volunteers to blow their discs up. Anybody? Takers? We're going to do a couple thousand consecutive crunches, and I'm hoping, my goal is a lumbar disc explosion. Are you in? No, you're not, right? You're like, I'll pass on that one. But even if you go back to Hodges, if you read Hodges' book, it's Segmental Spinal Stabilization, he talks about he did studies with one subject. Do you know who the one person stupid enough to do what he wanted him to do was? Him. He did deep needle EMGs to himself because he couldn't get anybody else when he was like, I'd like to stab a needle through 3 layers of your abdominal musculature to be able to figure out what your transverse abdominis is doing. He was not getting a tremendous amount of volunteers. Right? So just think, when people say that, when they argue about, oh, it was the wrong kind of spine or whatever, it's like, I always look at those people like, tell me about your spinal research, right? That's what I'd like to know. How much time have you spent, in the lab with spines? So this guy really, this guy changed everything for me, for us, for what we're doing. This was the big game changer. Everything else was sort of leading up to that, right? And that's obviously his book. No, available in Portuguese. At the table outside. How's that, Carlos? That work okay for you? But now the next thing comes along, the breathing phase. The influence of PRI in yoga. Sue was talking about how she did a whole presentation to get me to like it. I still don't like yoga, but I just don't think it was as bad as I did before. But it was still, now with breathing, now there's a little more emphasis on flexion. Now we're thinking about repositioning ribs, and it changed a lot for us. When we started to understand breathing, the process changed pretty drastically. Because watch this. This is pretty interesting. I love it. So if I inhale, my diaphragm contracts concentrically and comes down. I found this video after Sue's talk. I was kind of like, I still don't really get it. But I went to YouTube. That's right. YouTube is the greatest thing in the world. Maybe the second greatest thing in the world. Maybe third, but it's up there. But you can go to YouTube and just think, okay, I want a picture of or a video of how the diaphragm works, and there it is. But when I looked at that, because now we're seeing, rib cages moving and the diaphragm descending, and we're realizing what that idea of diaphragmatic breathing, all this stuff. It's like, oh, I get it. This kind of makes sense now. That this muscle's really, really important because that's a core muscle. That Mike talked about it yesterday. That's the top of the canister. For the longest time, we were like, it wasn't a canister. It was like an empty cup. We didn't even realize it had a top on it. And if we did realize it had a top on it, we didn't realize the top had anything to do with what was going on. So that's really, really important to understand how the diaphragm works. Because as we said, when we inhale, the diaphragm contracts concentrically. This is the next most important thing. When we exhale, the deep abdominal muscles assist in end-stage exhalation. That's the big game changer for me. When you start looking at what we're doing for core training, this idea that end stage exhalation causes you to recruit your deep abdominal musculature. And underneath there's a PRI article called The Value of Blowing Up a Balloon. And in The Value of Blowing Up a Balloon, basically what they ask you to do is they ask you to sit and put a balloon in your mouth, blow the balloon up while you're seated. Now what you realize immediately when you start trying to do this, so if I was to do this, if I was to sit down, put a balloon in my mouth, and then think, okay, the first breath is easy, right? I automatically, through my nose. Second breath, you're like, ooh, what do I do? Right? Because now you realize, well, what I got to do is I got to cap the balloon with my tongue on the roof of my mouth. I got to keep my mouth closed. I got to inhale again through my nose, and then I got to blow again hard. And what they want you to do is try to blow the balloon all the way up while you're sitting down. What you realize, what happens at the end of that exercise is you feel your deep abdominal musculature. You start to realize that as I'm straining, keep blowing that balloon up, and to inhale and keep blowing that balloon up, that I'm recruiting my deep abdominal musculature because they are muscles of exhalation, particularly end stage exhalation. So that becomes really important. And so just to give you an example, what I want you to do, sit here, and not yet, but I want you to think. I'm going to ask you to inhale through your nose. And I'm going to ask you to do that and count to 5. Then I'm going to ask you to exhale as hard as you can, like you would I say, like you're blowing out candles at my birthday party. It'll be 60 candles this year. So you got to be like, but you got to do it for 10 seconds. You can't stop. And no matter if you run out of air, you have to keep trying to exhale until I finish counting to 10, okay? So that's the exercise. We're going to do it. So inhale through your nose. 2, 3, 4, 5. Exhale hard. 3, 4, 5. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. 9, 10. What'd you feel? Abs, right? End stage exhalation. So this is why we said this draw-in idea. What we realized is I could say to you, pull your abdominal muscles in, try to get really skinny. Right? That would be me trying to tell your brain what to do. Or I could say to you, blow out as hard as you can. And you know what would happen? The exact same thing. Except in one case, I was trying to tell you what to do. In the other case, your brain was telling you what to do. So when we start talking about core training, we've changed our core training now, where all the time that we're doing core training, we're talking to people about breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth. When we're going to do a concentric contraction, whatever that is, if I want you to bridge up, when you bridge up, exhale out hard. When you floor slide, and I say put your arms up over your head, I could say contract your abdominal muscles and try to keep your ribs over your pelvis. Or I could say exhale as hard as you can. Right? So we've realized that cueing breathing cues the abdominal muscle action that we want. So suddenly now we've really been able to link breathing to core training. The good and the bad, well, actually I'm going to get ahead of myself. I don't want to get ahead of myself. That's the actual article. We won't spend a lot of time. This is, I don't know if Sue came back in or not. She might still be signing books out there, but yeah. My yoga apology, that looks way better in English than it does in, because yoga apology, like it's translated, it's not good. In English, it's really good. But the interesting thing, and I used to say this to Sue all the time, I can't tell you the number of yoga people who said to me over the course of my career, you need to work on breathing with your athletes. And of course, I was a wise ass. And I would always answer, I don't need to work on breathing with any of my athletes. All my athletes are breathing, right? Because I'm like, I don't have any dead people. Thank God, no dead athletes. So I used to think like, it's like, why, stop talking to me about breathing, okay? We're all breathing, we're good. And then I realized I was completely wrong. And that I should be teaching people to breathe, and that nasal inhalation matters. Nasal inhalation matters, pursed-lipped exhalation matters. And there's a huge amount of data to support both of those things. If you start looking, if just, type in nasal inhalation into your computer, and lots of stuff will come up. talking about vasodilation and the fact that your nose is a filter and that it's going to filter out air. You're supposed to be breathing in through your nose. If you look up pursed lipped exhale, you will see in respiratory therapy, respiratory therapists have been talking about pursed lipped exhalation for people with breathing disorders for 40 years. And so this is another one of these things, and Michael Mullen sent me another slide yesterday that I didn't have time to get in here, but one of the things I start talking about, training is like archaeology. We find old stuff, and then we think that we're like explorers or something, that, oh, look what I found. It's like, this shit's been there 40 years. We just were too stupid to use it, okay? So, we've got to realize, but this idea of teaching somebody to breathe, but it's amazing when you say, okay, I'm going to teach my client how to breathe. And I can remember when someone first said it, I was like, how am I going to teach someone how to breathe who's obviously breathing? And then someone said, well, just have them, tell them exactly what you want them to do. Inhale through your nose, but don't let your chest move. Think, I want it to be down here, like, what we would call maybe a diaphragmatic breath. And I want more lower rib action. I want a little more breath down into my abdominal area, right? And then I want you to exhale hard. But I had one of my older clients, and I told him exactly that. Okay, here's what I want you to do. I want you to inhale through your nose. And I want you to feel that here, stomach, lower rib cage. And he looked at me, he goes, okay. And I said, okay, go. And he went, and I was like, oh, I realized dysfunctional breathing. It was like so simple. I looked at it, I was like, and honestly, when you go back and try it with your clients, you'll be amazed because you'll tell them exactly what you want them to do, and then they won't do it. They'll gulp in a big, huge breath. Like my client was like, and I was like, neck pain, right? And he's like, oh, all the time. Because one thing we know, accessory muscles of inhalation are up here, right? Levator, sternocleidomastoid, up in this area. So all your people, since I've started working on breathing, my neck pain has gotten significantly better. I used to have very consistent neck pain. I would be one of those people who was always getting somebody to work on my neck, massage my neck. I got a kink in my neck. We start doing breathing exercises. I start learning to use the right muscles versus the wrong muscles. I start learning to nasal inhale. That stuff goes away. So this is going to be almost like an accidental thing that you're going to do for your clients that's going to be really, really good. This is amazing. Franco Colombo just passed away a couple weeks ago. But watch this. You want to talk about deep abdominal power? Watch though. He's blowing up a hot water balloon. Not a balloon, a hot water bottle, excuse me. Watch that. Look at his abs. Look at his rib cage. That's that value of blowing up a balloon article on steroids, literally. No joke. But when you see what was going on here in terms of the movement of his rib cage and the movement of his abdominal musculature and the amount of core power that guy had to be able to break a hot water bottle. I have trouble blowing up the balloon. Seriously, I'm not kidding. I have trouble blowing up the balloon. That's not a lie. That's honest. But the interesting thing, so from a wisdom standpoint, right, if you're involved in martial arts or you're involved in judo, they've been saying this forever, right? Martial arts people have always talked about chi. Whatever, the center force, right? If you took judo, and again, obviously there's lots of martial arts in Brazil, ki, right? They teach you ki. It's one of the first things they teach you. And they don't tell you to fall and hit the mat. They tell you to fall and hit the mat and yell. You know why they want you to yell? Because they want you to recruit your deep abdominal muscles to stabilize. So as long as there has been judo, people have known that violent grunt kind of thing, ki, will turn those muscles on and will protect you when you fall. So this is what I keep talking about, this idea that we knew it all along, but we just weren't smart enough, at least I wasn't, to figure it out. To see, to put the pieces of the puzzle together. It was like I had a puzzle when pieces were all over the place. Now my puzzle is a little bit better. But the other thing you want to ask yourself when you start talking about all these guys, McGill and whatever, why don't they all agree? I think in some cases they don't agree because it's really hard to give a lecture or do a course or do a seminar if you get up there and agree with the person that went before you. Although I think we do a pretty good job of it here. But I just think sometimes people think, oh, I've got to be controversial. Like Stuart McGill will really get adamant about bracing versus drawing in, you know, and that the Australians were completely wrong and his thing is completely right. And I'm kind of like, you know, I don't think that's really that big a deal. What we're trying to say to you is I need your abdominal musculature to be tight. How we're going to do that, whether Stu says the brace, Paul Hodges says the draw in, I'm saying the exhale. And I think that's because I've taken all the pieces and I know that Stu's saying I want the core to be stable and not move. And I know that Hodges is saying I want the core to be stable and not move. And I know that now suddenly from exhalation, I can make that core stable and not move. Makes perfect sense, right? Because crazy, and this, I don't know the Brazilian stats, but I do know the US stats. $50 billion a year, billion with a B, okay, on back pain. 650,000 surgical procedures in the United States per year for back pain at a cost of about $20 billion. Huge. There is huge money in back pain. And I said, in the US economy, I don't think they want us to solve back pain. Because if we solve back pain, we hurt the hospital industry. We take out one of the leading profit centers in the American hospital industry when we solve back pain. Because there's way more money in putting rods in people and taking discs out and doing all this other stuff than there is in showing them how to exercise correctly. That's awesome for us, to be honest. Because I always think, if you can learn to handle clients with back pain, you don't ever have to do anything else, at least not in the United States. If people's backs feel better, if people's backs get better, you'll never lack for clients. But this is interesting. Stanley Paris would be regarded in the United States as the father of physical therapy. And one of the things that Paris said, pain never precedes dysfunction. So when you get someone who comes to you, and I said, you know, Sue was talking a lot about pain. Yes, there are some neurological, you know, phantom pain syndromes. But in general, if someone comes into you and says, my back hurts, they have some level of dysfunction. That level of dysfunction, I would call it a predictable level of dysfunction. We're going to talk about kind of what the predictable dysfunctions are. Right. Really predictable, two types of back pain. Extension-related back pain, flexion-related back pain. Most of the people that we're going to see is going to be flexion-related back pain. It's going to be people who sit too much. People who sit too much stress the system in a negative way. That's why when we think about, you know, we don't do flexion anymore, right? Well, yeah, we don't do a lot of flexion. We're not going to do crunches. We're not going to do sit-ups. We're not going to do repeat flexion because we know that flexion is the problem. Flexion it's going to be really tough for flexion to be the problem and the answer at the same time. So we've got to think, we got to decrease the amount of flexion that we get that person to do. And then, as we said, two problems, and this is what we talked about. So as weak hip flexors. So if I have someone with weak hip flexors and I ask them to flex their hip, generally someone will do this. Okay? If somebody does that, if that's their hip flexion pattern, you know, come up to about 80 degrees and then start to lean down to it, they're telling me that their deep hip flexors don't work well. That they can't, because I should be able to cleanly bring my hip up above 90 degrees and hold it there. So that's going to be one problem. The other one we're going to see is extension instead of hip extension. So those were, from a motor control standpoint, those are going to be the things that we're going to work really hard to control. We're going to try to get people that can extend their hips without extending their spine. We're going to try to get people that can flex their hips without flexing their spine. So, and this is where I go back to like Stuart McGill's talks. He'd always talk about spare the spine. In his talks, that was the one thing that stuck in my mind all the time. Spare the spine. Okay? 90% of the time when we get somebody's back better, we have not done anything for their back. What we've done is we've taught them how to spare the spine. We've taught them how to stabilize it. We've taught them how to move their hips instead of their spine. We've taught them how to move their extremities instead of their spine. So we've removed the dysfunction. If you go back to the Paris quote, if we remove the dysfunction, a lot of times the pain just goes away on its own. And it works amazingly well. So here's your first example, right? How many times have you seen people do that type of stuff? And I asked Trisha in this video, I said, Trisha, perform hip extension as wrong as you possibly can, right? So that was a perfect example, but it's amazing. I will tell you, I've seen hundreds of people doing that, and when I say to them, ask them what they're doing, they'll tell me, I'm doing the exercises my physical therapist showed me. And this is one of the reasons I don't like unsupervised exercise. Because the person, if you take someone who's got a really bad compensation pattern, and then you show them the right exercise, and let them go do it for homework on their own, they'll do it wrong. They'll go home and they'll compensate. This is why you've got to get people with you, and you've got to be really consistent about teaching them these motor control exercises, about teaching them how to move their spine, because if I'm going to do that same exercise here, what I really want to have happen is I want that person to be able to move their hip without moving their lumbar spine. I'm trying to get them to be able to recruit their glutes and their hamstrings as hip extensors, and I'm going to ask them to do that in the presence of a stable core, as opposed to that mess that you just saw. Right? And this is the same idea. This is what I talked about, lumbar flexion for hip flexion. Like Tricia, you look, that's perfect. She's probably, 30 degrees above the horizontal. Her muscles work the way they're supposed to work. But if I start to see that, and we can see that, it's amazing. I can tell right away, people with back pain, when someone starts warming up and I see this, I'm like, oh my God, that person's gonna have back pain. They're gonna have flexion-related back pain because they're moving, they've realized my hips don't move, so I gotta make my spine move. And what I'm gonna want that person to do is be like, nope, I need you to get your hips to move and not your spine. Simple corrections will change lots of stuff. And then, if you look, like we said, how many people are familiar with FMS so that I can, okay, not a ton, but basically, okay, good, well, sorry, that was the little delay. No, sorry, I know, you were off by 2 seconds, come on. He's been instantaneous almost. But when you really look at that, right, this is hurdle step. And the one before is rotary stability. You start to understand, and this is why I said you start to see the similarities. You start to look at the FMS and think, what am I looking for in the FMS? Well, what I'm looking for, rotary stability. Can they move their hip instead of their spine? Hip flexion. Can they move their hip instead of their spine? So when I'm starting to look for these things, I know now in those tests what I am looking for. So, really simple. Assess and evaluate. Does it hurt? I wrote an article called Does It Hurt? Maybe 10 years ago. And I'm constantly sending people saying, read the Does It Hurt article. Because the simplest thing, when you are trying to get somebody better, much like, okay, if your fingers are stuck in the car door, the first thing I want to do is get your fingers out of the car door. Right? Imagine if I came in, you got your fingers stuck in the car door, and I started talking to you about it. Right? Well, how do they hurt? How bad? How long have you been in there? Right? The person is like, open the friggin' door, please. Right? Don't do stuff that hurts. Like, it's really simple. I ask clients all the time, and Michael was alluding to this in his talk, asking somebody what they feel. What does that feel like? And I tell them the key to does it hurt is that it is a yes/no question. If I say to you, does that hurt? You can only say yes or no. Because clients, right, clients lie because they want to exercise. So clients will say stuff like, oh, it's not bad. And I'm like, that's yes. And they'll say, after I warm up, it's pretty good. I'm like, that's yes. Or they'll say something, oh, but it hurts all the time. Still yes. We want no. So when we are going to try to help somebody get out of pain, we can't put them back into pain. And we are going to deal, some people in the U.S., people are starting, you shouldn't be working on clients with pain. Like, well, you know something? You're going to friggin' starve to death. Because everybody's got pain. If you have a client, honestly, if you've got a client over the age of 30 that you train who doesn't have some pain, who doesn't come in and be like, my neck, my back, my shoulder, like if they don't have something, I think we got to know our limits, but I think we have to realize that, yeah, we're going to be dealing with people who have pain. So how do we do it, right? When do we do it? Before a workout, during the workout as rest. We're going to do it before as warm-up. We may do it during the workout as rest in between sets of strength exercises. We may look, like I said, when you look at what we're going to do in the practical, we might say, oh, that's a mobility exercise. Yeah. You might say, oh, that's a glute activation exercise. Yep. The best exercises, I think, are mobility exercises and activate muscles and have a core component. When we can find those exercises, and we're going to show you a bunch, those are ones that are keepers that are in the warm-up all of the time. And like I said, you might look at it and say, well, those are motor control exercises. Those are FMS correctives. Yeah, they're all of the above. But what they really are good warm-ups that teach us what we want to do from a core training perspective. Makes it simple. Because really, core training is about neuromuscular reeducation. Core training is about teaching somebody how to get, most of these people have managed to rewire themselves wrong. And what we're going to do and what we're going to show you in the practical is how to rewire yourself right. Okay, here's what the right thing is supposed to feel like. So Sue had alluded to, she was talking about, so it's interesting when I said great minds think alike, right? This is one of my favorite core exercises. And someone might look and say, core exercise? And I'm like, yeah, core exercise. I love the sandbags. Josh Henkin has the ultimate sandbag. I don't get any money from Josh. I don't work for Josh, but I do really like the sandbags. Because the sandbag, when we start talking about breathing, if I put, and you can use anything, it doesn't matter what you put, but if I put something on your abdominal region, and then I say, I need you to inhale through your nose, and I want that object to go up. And then when you put your hands up over your head, I want you to exhale out hard, and I want that object to go down. So if I look at, you might look at that exercise and think, well, that exercise is for your external rotators. And I would say yes. You might look at that exercise and say, actually, that exercise is stretching your internal rotators. And I'd say yes again. Someone else might say, well, actually, it's really for your scapular stabilizers. And I'd say yes again. But what I'd say more than anything is it's a breathing and a core exercise. Because now I'm going to try to teach you how to integrate ribs, pelvis, abdominals, and upper body movement. That makes that a really high value warm-up exercise. Same way when you go here, leg lower, right? People look at leg lowers, and I love people say, oh, that's hamstring stretching. And really, when you think about this, is this hamstring stretching? Yeah, run that again one more time. And I would say, yeah, it kind of is. But the thing is, when you really look at that, right? Sandbag, trying to produce an extension force. So now I've got to counter that extension force with, like Michael talked about, some flexion moments, right? The leg that I'm stretching is the up one. But I've got to use my hip flexors in a coordinated fashion to control the lowering of my other side. I've got to use my deep abdominal musculature so that I don't pull myself up to extension while I'm doing that. I have to use the hip flexors of my up leg to keep that leg in the correct position. I need to use the quadricep of my up leg to keep that up leg extended. So when you think about that and say hamstring stretch, I'm like, That's about 10 things going on at the same time. And this is what's interesting because we used to always think like, single joint exercise, right, is non-functional. But that's a single joint exercise. There's only one joint moving. And I'm going to tell you that's a super functional exercise. Because even though only one joint is moving, there's a lot of things going on. Okay? We're using our neuromuscular system to, yes, produce some hamstring length. And when we look at that exercise, what do we got? FMS, active straight leg raise, right? So again, the pieces of the puzzle start to connect and you start to realize why this is important. When we think about speed development, hip separation, that's why active straight leg raise is important. When we think about the ability to flex and extend the hips without compensatory movement of the lumbar spine. So again, leg lower becomes a really good warm-up exercise. The good thing, just so you know, and I always say this, your clients don't need to know. And just so you know, your clients don't care. You don't need to explain any of this to them. You're just going to say, we're going to do that leg lowering exercise. And they'll be like, oh, it's a kick-ass ab exercise. I'm like, oh, yeah, it is. It's so good. Whatever, Whatever makes you happy, whatever keeps you doing the exercise, I'm fine with it. But what you've got to realize is you've actually got some super complicated neuromuscular stuff going on in these seemingly simple movements. Same idea here, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, I switched fields on myself. Because this goes back to, we talked about functional anatomy. Sorry, I'm going to take a minute to talk about functional core anatomy. Right? Does anybody actually, again, think that that's what your abdominal muscles actually do? Can you think of any activity that you're going to be involved in where your abdominal muscles are going to be asked to pull your rib cage down towards your pelvis? Right? No, it's not what they do. So that's one of the things we've got to realize. When we think about functional anatomy, your anterior abdominal musculature is a stabilizing system that is designed, its goal is prevention of extension. Its goal is not flexion. So it's back to that live person, dead person thing again, right? In a dead person, someone, okay, make that muscle contract. Okay, yeah, the person does a sit-up. So that must be what it does. But the reality is what I'm really does this, right? If my abdominal muscles don't work, my wife hates when I do this, but, right? Your abdominal muscles are made to keep your internal organs in position. That's their job. They're made to keep your spine in position. That's their job. Their job is not to produce flexion. They never produce flexion, almost never. I won't worry about that. But this, now when you talk about anti-extension, this is anti-extension. Whether you use TRX, whether you use rings, whatever it is. Let's see, will that one run? This might be another one of those ones that doesn't want to run. Oh, like we said, Sue, old ones, some of the old ones don't run. But if you can imagine, just fallouts, we're just going to ask that person to fall forward, and we're going to stress their extensors, or their flexors, excuse me. And they're going to have to produce that anti-extension force. And there's tons of ways that we can do that. Same thing here, right? Oh, sorry, let's go back one. Oh, I clicked too many times. No, keep going back, sorry. Keep going. I want to get back two more to side plank. Because when we think about functional anatomy, right, these lateral muscles are anti-lateral flexors. Their job is to prevent side bending, which is why we do, if you look at McGill's exercise, he's a huge side plank person. He's a huge side plank person because we need to get that muscle to do the thing that it is supposed to do, which is to prevent lateral movement. Versus if we look at here, right? Sit. And just say, I did all the dumb ones myself. But you think about that, right? How stupid is that? But you know what's stupider than that? The stupider exercise is the 2 dumbbell one. You ever see the guy in the gym with the 2 dumbbells? Right? And I always want to be with the 2 dumbbell guy. I want to be like, have you seen a seesaw? Like, do you know what a seesaw looks like? Like, if people are the same weight on both sides, it just goes like if someone said, well, I really would like to figure out a way to grind up some discs. I'm like, well, that might do it. I said, and if you really want to grind them, just put one in each hand and just keep going side to side like that. Then you can really throw things off. So we need to think all the time about this functional anatomy idea and ask ourselves, what's that muscle supposed to do? And yes, like Sue said, I understand. You should be able to side bend. You should be able to rotate. You should be able to flex. I get it. But generally speaking, what we need to do is work. We talked about a deliberately constrained system. I'm working on the constraints. The great analogy, someone said, it's like a sailboat analogy. He said, I'm going to go out sailing, but I'm not going to tie any of the ropes to the sails. Just going to kind of see how they do. Just let them flap around out there. It wouldn't work there very well, right? You want the sailboat to move, you got to control the constraints so that it moves the way that it's supposed to. You want the body to move, you got to control the constraints the way it's supposed to. It's not that it's, the sails, we know the sail's supposed to move, but we've got to know exactly how much it's supposed to move. Same idea here in terms of anti-rotation, and this one, again, because it's from the same batch, this one may not run either. But, when we think about this, go back one, even though it's not going to run, just move it back one slide for me. That's going to be, it would be like an anti-rotation press, pal-off press demonstration. But again, anti-rotation, the rotary muscles, I can remember reading the Porterfield and DeRosa's Mechanical Low Back Pain was a huge game changer book for me. Because all of a sudden, literally I saw the words. He said, rather than think of the muscles as rotators, think of them as anti-rotators. Rather than thinking of them as flexors, think of them as anti-extension muscles. And I was like, it was that same like, duh. Can't believe I didn't think of that on my own. But same idea here. We want to be able to prevent and control rotation. And there's a lot of people, so the argument, well, we can go to the next one, sorry. And this is when people like wood choppers. Again, that's just stupid. I don't have any idea like what muscle that would even be supposed to be working. And I love when I see people do, and I'm kind of like, I don't know. I had trouble doing that one, like to even show how bad it was. I had trouble actually doing it because I was like, I have no idea how this works. But you'll get lots of people here who'll say, well, but I deal with, I have tennis players, or I have golfers, or I have people, that have to rotate their spine. And, Sue talked about talking to coaches. One of the things great coaches will tell you right off the bat is good golfers don't rotate their spine. Good golfers rotate their hips. Okay, we need hip internal, external rotation, not lumbar rotation. Yeah, there's some, but again, it's that controlled, constrained system. We don't need more. It's the same exorcist idea. I don't need to be able to turn my head around so I can see behind me. Okay, the system is supposed to be constrained. The hips are what should be having the majority of the motion, and the spine should be having very little. Ooh. Same idea, hip internal, external rotation, much more. And this is the other thing, is this core training? So it's kind of interesting. Let's see, this one, I'm bummed. A bunch of these don't want to run today. Same here, right? Well, this one will run. Is that core training? I think it is. Right? Because there's anti-lateral flexion going on in there. There's anti-rotation going on in there. When we talk about, Sue just talked about the idea too about unilateral training. When we do unilateral training, we automatically incorporate a core component into what we're doing. When we do bilateral training, we shut most of that stuff off. We don't need it. That's why I hate people who say, if you just do squats and deadlifts heavy, you don't need to do any more core. And I'm like, yeah, that's if you want to maybe like lift refrigerators for a living. But if you want to move around, you're going to need to be stable and strong in unilateral stance. Same idea here. Is this core training? Yeah, that's core training. Because when we look at that and this animate muscles in motion, this guy did a really cool job of animating these things. But when you look at what has to happen, right, there's that anti-rotation component of that tall kneeling cable press. And Michael talked about the same idea, transitional posture, starting in quadruped and working, tall kneeling, half kneeling. If you look, all of these things you can look at and think, these are all core progressions for your clients. Because now I'm incorporating pressing with that anti-rotation component, and eventually I can incorporate a more dynamic rotation component, but I can't incorporate a dynamic rotation component until I've mastered the stability part. Right? Half kneel, same idea. Half kneel cable press. Lunge cable press. Those, I'd say every one of those is a core exercise. I don't want to hit because I'm supposed to be done. Core exercise. I love push-ups. Push-ups is a great anterior core exercise. The reason most people can't do push-ups is not because they're not strong enough. It's because they don't have that anterior core, that anti-extension strength that we need that person to have. Single arm dumbbell press, core exercise. Another anti-rotation exercise. So we've got to be able to look at all this stuff and think this is all ring rows, core exercise. So when I'm talking about somebody who's got a back problem, I'm going to try to incorporate as much stuff. Again, one arm, one leg row. This is that, Michael talked about the reciprocal system, and Kevin and I were saying, I think one of the reasons we don't see a lot of problems is because we already do so much reciprocal unilateral stuff. It's already part of what we do. Okay, but again, what are we doing? We talked, yesterday in the 2 days ago in the practical about driving hip internal, external rotation. So it's important. Joint by joint. I'm not going to talk because most of you have probably already seen this, but just the basic idea: your ankles should be able to move, your knees should be stable, your hips should be able to move, your lumbar spine should be stable. That's what's really important. Your thoracic spine should be able to move. Okay, we want to be able to think about those things, but we can't. I could spend an hour on joint by joint. So then I'm going to hit these last two things. I told Carlos I'd go an hour. Sorry, I lied because I'm going to end up going longer than that. But two things I want you to avoid, like I said, repeat flexion and attempting to increase rotational range of motion of the spine, right? So this is what I said from Porterfield and DeRosa, right? Rather than considering the abdominals as flexors and rotators of the trunk, for which they certainly have the capacity, their function might be better viewed as anti-rotators and anti-lateral flexors of the trunk. That was a game changer for me. That was like, wow, I never thought about it in that way when I read that book. This is from Sarman's book. This is what's important as far as rotation. The overall range of lumbar rotation is approximately 13 degrees. The rotation between each segment from T10 to L5 is 2 degrees. The greatest rotational range is between L5 and S1, which is 5 degrees. The thoracic spine, not the lumbar spine, should be the site of the greatest amount of rotation of the trunk. When an individual practices rotational exercises, he or she should be instructed to think about the motion occurring at the chest. Okay? So we don't want to encourage lumbar rotation. We know that we have it, but we have that deliberately constrained system. We have that 13 degrees for a reason. So trying to get people to improve that range of motion is generally not going to be a good idea. And this is really important. Rotation of the lumbar spine is more dangerous than beneficial, and rotation of the pelvis and lower extremities to one side, while the trunk remains stable or is rotated to the other side, is particularly dangerous. I want you to absorb what this says. Rotation of the lumbar spine is more dangerous than beneficial. And rotation of the pelvis and the lower extremities to one side while the trunk remains stable or is rotated to the other side is particularly dangerous. That's page 72 of Diagnosis and Treatment of Movement Impairment Syndromes, right? Watch this. And what is that? That's rotation of the hips and pelvis to one side while the upper body remains stable, right? So these were exercises that we used to do in warm-up. These are exercises that I forbid people to do now. Because if we go back one slide and we say rotation of the lumbar spine is more dangerous than beneficial, and rotation of the pelvis and lower extremities to one side while the trunk remains stable or is rotated to the other side, she uses the word particularly dangerous. She doesn't even say it's dangerous. She says it's particularly dangerous. And again, when you start looking at the experts, there's lots of people. Philip Beach says the same thing. Beach talks about the idea that rotation is particularly dangerous, that it's a bad idea. This is a bad idea. This is on the top of the don't list. Okay, the don't list are exercises like that and crunches. Also on the don't list, because this goes in the just plain stupid category, okay? That's just a dumb exercise. Because I don't have any idea. If you can try to explain to me what the hell that has to do with anybody's life, I don't know. Who is going to end up in a situation where they think, again, I'm hanging from a building, right? And I need to save myself maybe. Most of us have not been in life-threatening situations of that type. That's just dumb. And people say, it really makes my abs sore. That's what I love. I love that one. It really makes me sore. And I say, okay, I'm going to give you my next really stupid analogy. I know a way to make you unbelievably sore. I'm going to take you out back behind the gym and I'm going to beat the crap out of you with a baseball bat. Right? Is there anybody who's going to look at me and think, oh, that was a really good idea. I'm so sore. Like, I'm like crippled. And I'm like, oh yeah, I hit you in the ass, I hit you in the legs, I hit you in the chest, I hit you all over the place. Make you as sore as I possibly could. Right? The idea that making a muscle sore somehow qualifies as being a good exercise is stupid. The amount of soreness that you can produce is generally showing you that something's wrong as opposed to something's right. So, don't do that. So is all flexion bad? No. I don't think all flexion is bad. Again, Sue's showing you child's pose. Michael's showing you things. But repeat flexion is bad. Repeat continually flexing. If you look at McGill's research, that practicing repeat flexion is not good for your discs. Practicing repeat flexion for people who are spending a lot of time sitting in flexion, not good for you. So again, we've thrown all flexion out. We don't do much. We don't do any flexion. We don't do crunches. We do one sit-up version, but that's a story for another day. And this is from McGill's book, and you can read it. It's in your notes. I'm going to try, because I told Carlos I'd try to squeeze this thing down to an hour. So back one. So when we think about in conclusion, one, keep it simple, right? Keep it simple. Use progressions and regressions. That's part of keeping it simple. Think anti, when we're thinking about core training, think anti-extension, anti-lateral flexion, anti-rotation, as opposed to flexion, lateral flexion, or rotation. And then think, does it hurt? Those are the big takeaways that we want to get out of this. Lastly, and I think I talked about some of these books anyway. Let's see if we can jump to that next one. Again, McGill's book is out there. Everybody should read McGill's book. Everybody should read, as I said, Sarman's book. Everybody should read it. Everybody should read Mechanical Low Back Pain. Hodges' segmental spinal stabilization almost now falls in the historical reference category, but it's still pretty interesting. Sue talked about Beach's muscles and meridians. Super interesting, and another guy who's not a big proponent of rotation of the lumbar spine. And then pull up that value of blowing up a balloon article and read it. Hopefully that's translated somewhere for you. And if not, one of our smart friends here that's translating stuff is going to figure out how to translate it. Thank you. This is my last one. Thank you very much. We'll do practicals at 4:30. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you. Vocês estão ouvindo aqui? Estão ouvindo transmissão? Estão ouvindo tradução?
Todos. O prazer de apresentar um novo livro em português, Mecânico da Lombar.
Português.
All back pain is a cause. The key is to find the cause through a proper assessment. So the book begins dispelling some of the myths and then guides the reader through 9 self-assessments. Then they are guided on how to stop the cause of their pain with appropriate spine hygiene, and then build a foundation for pain-free activity. Building appropriate mobility of socket joints, appropriate proximal stability for distal athleticism. Diverse perform better summit. Come my bom amigo Carlos Felix.
I love it.